So today we are going to talk about population ecology. Let me just say this, again, as a reminder for the way that this particular class has come together, I have taken the full course that I used to teach to the upper division biology majors in general ecology, introductory to ecology, and I've essentially compressed it to these 4 classes. And when I taught general ecology, the population ecology section of the class typically was the most difficult for the students because it is fairly quantitative, it is fairly mathematical in nature. So in putting today's class together, I have attempted to try to get that under control to a point where what I'm going to tell you is absorbable, but not too stupid. Okay, so that was my goal and what I'm trying to do. So let's go right to the beginning and talk about populations. You all have a sense of what a population is. In ecology, a population is generally thought of as a group of organisms, all of the same species, that are connected in some way with one another. And by connected, it's a vague term, but by connected, we typically mean reproductively connected. So a group of organisms that have the capacity of reproducing with one another could be considered a population. And in some cases, that becomes very explicit and obvious. And in other cases, it's extremely unclear. So when we talk about, for example, a global population of humans, in a sense, they have the capacity of interbreeding with one another, but in a much more realistic sense, most people from most nations do not. So it's more correct to think of the population of, say, Africa, or a country in Africa, or the United States, or North America, or something of that sort. So that's the notion of a population. Demography is the study of population change, increase, decline. Demography involves, again, functional relationships. That is, how do populations change through time? And our goal in understanding population biology is to create structure that allows us to understand that process. In other words, not just a description of the change, but what are the things that are causing that change to occur as it does. Typically, we do that by use of mathematical equations and graphs. And I'll do some of that today. I have attempted to put that together in a way that I hope will be absorbable to virtually everybody. And so that was my goal. And I spent a fair amount of time on this class, especially over last weekend, trying to make sure. I actually went through it with my wife, who is a physiologist, who's not an ecologist. And I asked her, do you understand this? And she said, yes. So if you don't, blame her. Okay. Fundamental demographic processes. What are the things that make populations go up and down? Very simple. They're really just 4 or 2 groups of 2. One of them is reproduction and mortality. The growth in numbers occurs from increased births, and the reduction in numbers comes from increased deaths. In many cases, or in some cases, these populations that are described in their entirety from a dynamical perspective, from just reproduction and mortality, also have the added dimension of immigration and immigration. That is, animals leaving a population or coming into a population from somewhere else. Population dynamics that involve this immigration and immigration are called open population dynamics. Those that have to do with just reproduction and mortality, which is what we're going to do today. We're just going to talk about this because this stuff gets very complicated and is oftentimes very vague. These are referred to as closed populations. So we're going to talk about closed population dynamics. In talking about population dynamics, there are a variety of different kinds of models that we discuss or that we think about. And I'm going to run through those with you right now. And I've done it in a series of dichotomies just to try to make the major points. So a population model, a description of process in a population as it changes through time, can be either deterministic or stochastic. What's the difference? A deterministic model is one that's purely mathematical. It's exact. A stochastic model involves variation. All right, that's the only difference between the two. Okay. Another dichotomy is between what we call discrete and continuous populations. A continuous, and a great example of a continuous population are human beings. And the reason is that we are at any instant in time, both dying and reproducing. So for populations that at any particular instance in time, there is the capacity for both death and birth, those are called continuous populations. For those populations that behave somewhat differently, that is, that reproduce seasonally, and most wild organisms do this, those are discrete populations. So compare, for example, human beings on the one hand versus elephant seals at Año Nuevo Island, which you've all been up to see on the other. And as you know, if you've been up there to study the elephant seals, you know that they always reproduce during a short period of time in the early winter, all right? So all the births occur at just one little blip in time, and that creates a very different kind of dynamic than for a continuous population. So that's the difference between a discrete and a continuous population. Population growth can be either density dependent or density independent. Density independent growth is growth that doesn't depend at all on how many individuals there are in the population at that particular time. Density dependent growth occurs when that number becomes sufficiently large that it starts to influence both the reproduction and mortality of the other individuals. So that's a simple dichotomy between density dependent and density independent growth. Population models and the conceptualization of process of population change can involve either age-structured populations or non-age-structured populations. Most populations are age-structured. Humans, for example, are age-structured. We all are of an age from at birth to old, and the distribution of the numbers of individuals at different ages comprises or characterizes what we call the age structure of the population. There are other species that are essentially non-age structured. So for example, some insect that maybe has a pulse of growth one year and then dies out before winter is a non-age structured population. And the last kind of population models and the processes that we're going to talk about that influence population change are the interactions with other species. So we have models that both are with and without species interactions. So these are the 5 kinds of dichotomies of process that go into consideration of population dynamics and population biology, population change. And I'm going to go through all of those today with some examples and some explanation of how they work. I'm really not going to say much more about deterministic versus stochastic models. You just understand from what I said what the difference between the two is. All right. Okay, so now we have to just jump into an equation. And this is I'm putting these up there to represent for both a simple continuously growing population versus a simple discretely growing population, the logic of characterizing population change. So the simplest logic is really for characterizing population change of a continuously growing, non-age structured, non-density dependent population, all right? And we do this simply with this simple differential equation, which explains the rate of population change as nothing more than the size of the population, which is big N. We'll put the symbols up here. the size of the population times the intrinsic growth rate of the population, little r. And little r is nothing more than the birth rate minus the death rate, or the individual specific birth rate minus the death rate. So imagine a population of animals for which the average number of births per year is, let's say, 0.3. So on average, every individual will produce 0.3 offspring in a year. And let's imagine another, in that same population, that the average per capita death rate is 0.1. So the probability of dying during that year is 10%. In that particular situation, little r, which is the intrinsic rate of growth of the population, is simply 0.3 minus 0.1 or 0.2, all right? That is called the intrinsic rate of growth, and it's also sometimes referred to as the Malthusian parameter, after the famous demographer Thomas Malthus, all right? If you take this simple differential equation that explains growth and integrate that, you can actually compute the number of individuals through time. And this is the equation that results from the simple integration of this. So this is the equation for growth of a density independent, continuously growing population, all right? For a discrete population, we use a little bit of a different approach, but it produces exactly the same result. And that is, we imagine a parameter that we call lambda. And lambda is nothing more than the proportional change in the population from one time period to another. So for example, from this year to next year, or whatever the time units of change are, very commonly they're years. And so let's say that the population is increasing by about 10% a year. So that proportion RD, the proportional increase, would be 0.1. If we add that to 1, that becomes 1.1. And if we multiply that 1.1 times the population size at the year preceding, it gives us the population size at the year of interest, all right? And if we do that over and over again for year after year after year after year, running that series out, the equation that describes the abundance of population at time t compared with the abundance of the population at the starting time, time 0, is simply lambda to the t times the size of the population at time 0. So that's a lot of just the explanation of population growth that I would hope that you could kind of grasp from what I said. Some of you who are poets and artists and so on, who have no background in math, may not get this, but I hope you at least get the concepts. And those of you that come from more of a science background or engineering background, this should be very simple to you. Okay, so what does it look like for a population what is the functional relationship of a continuously growing population through time? As I said, this is the equation. I went back through that in the previous slide, all right? So if we start with a population, it's just an example that I put together last night. If we start with a population of 2 individuals, and that if the Malthusian parameter, the intrinsic rate of growth, is 0.3, and we run that population model through time, this is exactly what it's going to look like, all right? Population is going to grow, and over about 10 generations, these are the time units that I've used here, over 10 generations, that population is going to grow from 2 individuals to something like 40 some, all right? So anybody can do this. This is just the process we use to project population change using a continuous model. Using the discrete model, it looks a little different, although the trajectory is broadly exactly the same. And the reason it looks different is that the births occur in pulses. So you get this actual sawtooth type of a population growth curve when you use the discrete model compared with the continuous model. This particular model is one that I put together. I ran it out over a much longer period of time, but it was based on the same, roughly the same growth characteristics in birth and death rates, and starting with 2 individuals, and it produces a very similar shaped curve. So let's go to an example, all right? This is the math. This is the sort of the simple math of the way discrete and continuous populations grow. Let's go to an example. It's an interesting one because it leads us into the next concept as well. And this has to do with sheep in southern Australia. So everyone knows that Australia has sheep, but sheep were not put into southern Australia until the early 1800s, all right? So something about sheep. About 2 out of every 3 females produces 1 lamb a year. All right, so about 2 out of every 3 females reproduce every year, and about half of those lambs are males and about half of them are females. It's only the females that are subsequently reproducers, so the birth rate is 0.33, half of 2/3, all right? The death rate, just known from a lot of work on domestic sheep, is about 0.16, all right? So RD, this parameter in the discrete growth equation, is B minus D, or 0.17, and lambda equals RD, 0.17, plus 1, or 1.17. All right, so we just calculate that from this very simple information that we have about sheep that people know because they've been working on sheep and studying them and domesticating them and growing them forever and ever and ever, all right? So we start off with 10 sheep that were released in southern Australia in 1838. That's exactly what happened. They put 10 sheep into southern Australia in the early 1800s, 1838. And let's ask the question, how many sheep should there have been 40 years later? All right. It's really easy to make that calculation. We simply use our discrete growth equation, this one. We start out with 10, which is the beginning number. We use our value for lambda, which is 1.17. And T in this case is 40 years, 40 generations, or 40 cycles, time cycles. And so if we simply solve that equation, we come out with 5,339 sheep after 40 years. That's what we would predict. And here is a plot. This is a discrete, a deterministic plot, a there's no error, there's no variation in this. This is just the exact mathematical model of how we would expect the sheep population to grow. This is something that I calculated. It's very easy to do. These are data that someone else ran exactly the same analysis on, but they include all of the survey data of the abundance of sheep in southern Australia for that 40-year period. So the red line is the mathematical projection of how many sheep you would expect in southern Australia over that 40-year period. And the little blue line and dots are the numbers that were actually counted. And the reason that those numbers don't fall exactly on the red line is because of what we call stochasticity. We have measurement error and we have process error. We have error, or we have variation that creeps in because of wet years and dry years and all of that sort of thing. But overall, you can see that the blue real line of the number that were counted up through that 40-year period matches very well with the red line, with the fitted line, with the theoretical prediction. So we can just continue on. This is the first 40 years. This takes us up through 1878 for sheep in southern Australia. How many sheep might there have been 40 years later, 80 years from the beginning? And we should be able to make that same calculation, which we've done right here. I've done that, and instead of using 40 years as the time period, I've simply used 80 years. And I've calculated that after 80 years, instead of the 5,300 and some sheep that there were after 40 years, there would be 2,851,158 sheep if that sheep population grew exactly as we would expect for that 80-year period. So what does it look like? Because we have data, the Australians, the people who are working down there are keeping track of how many sheep there were. And it doesn't look like what you would expect. This is what it looks like. After 80 years, what happens is that the population starts to grow as it did before. I showed you the early part of this curve in the previous example, but then it stops. And it starts to fluctuate fairly wildly. It goes through periods of decline and periods of increase. Um, and so we don't have an example of a population growing continuously for 80 years. We have instead the beginnings of what we call density dependence. The sheep population has become sufficiently large that it is no longer growing in a density independent manner, right? So the population slowed and then stopped as resources became limiting. In other words, the population changed from being a density independent growing population to a density dependent population. And this happened because simply the birth rates decreased and or the death rates increased until the birth minus death equals 0. In other words, they were the same. When births and deaths are the same, lambda becomes 1, population stops growing. It's as simple as that. Here is just a sort of a more of a conceptualization of what must have happened. In the beginning, when the sheep population was very small, the birth rate was greater than the death rate. As the population grew, the death rate increased because of competition and resource limitation. The birth rate may have declined for the same reason, and at some point, those became equal. And when they became equal, the population stopped growing, and that point is what we call, in population biology, the carrying capacity. When a population is larger than the carrying capacity, it will decline. When a population is smaller than the carrying capacity, it will grow. So it's really pretty simple. And that's in some form, conceptually, what happened to sheep in Southern Australia, and that's what happens to every other species. No species can grow infinitely, and so all species will eventually decline or stop growing for this reason. So here are just plots of how we project both a density independent and a density dependent population, and this is what the growth curves look like. In the case of the density dependent population, all we do is take the density independent model and put a density dependent function into it. In this particular case, it's what we call linear density dependence. We simply take the carrying capacity, subtract from the carrying capacity the actual size of the population, divide that by the carrying capacity, and this value will range anywhere from 1 when the size of the population is near 0 to 0 when the size of the population is at carrying capacity. So this value simply ranges from 0 to 1. When the value is 1, the population behaves very much like a density independent population, and when the population size is around carrying capacity, it stops growing. And so you have these two different trajectories. One is pure exponential increase, density independent population growth, and the other is density dependent population growth. And this is also sometimes referred to as logistic population growth, all right? This makes sense. Every population is eventually going to be limited if something else doesn't by the environment that it lives in. And this equation here, which looks like a monster to some of you, especially the poets and so on, is really a pretty simple result of simply the integration of this differential equation that creates the process that we're interested in. So if you remember, if you took calculus and you remember how to do an integration and you integrate this function from the limits of time equals 0 to time equals whatever, you'll come up with this particular function, and that's just what we use to actually project the population. So what evidence is there for population density dependence in nature? There's vast amounts of it. This just happens to be an example from a laboratory experiment that was done. And this laboratory experiment was done with a freshwater crustacean, Daphnia. And Daphnia is an organism that's ubiquitous in a lot of freshwater systems. It's a zooplankton, and it is a prey population for a lot of fishes and other species, all right? So this experiment was simply done by growing populations at different population densities of Daphnia. all right? So here are the densities that they began with, and these are just the number of Daphnia per cubic centimeter of water, and this is the computed population growth rate. And when your population is very small, the growth rate is high, and when the population becomes bigger and bigger, the growth rate goes down. So these are experimental laboratory data showing the nature of density dependence. And in this particular case, the nature of that density dependence is fairly linear. Now you can see that it's a pretty constant function of increasing population density. That is, it falls off, right? So there are all kinds of examples of this sort. And my purpose here is just to get you to grasp kind of the basic processes of population limitation because of density dependence, all right? So this notion of density dependence and the creation of population models that reach some maximum because of resource limitation has extensive application in natural resource management. Every population, as I said, will eventually stop growing. Natural resource managers, in most cases, are interested in exploiting natural populations for human benefit. We do this for fish, we do it for timber, and we do it for wildlife. Those are the three main groups of organisms that are exploited. And the use, in all cases, the way in which managers attempt to exploit those populations to realize a maximum benefit on the one side, but to avoid over-exploiting the population on the other side, is to use density-dependent population models, all right? So here are just some pictures reiterating fish and fisheries, timber management, and wildlife management. And that the harvesting of these populations is achieved through the use of these density-dependent population models to obtain what is thought of as a maximum sustainable yield. The maximum sustainable yield is simply the most individuals that can be taken from a population that will be sustainable in the long term and will avoid driving the population inevitably downward toward extinction on the other. And in the simplest cases, in the most simple cases, this maximum sustainable yield value occurs at about the value of carrying capacity divided by 2. And about half the carrying capacity is generally the size of a population that will deliver the maximum sustainable yield. So does maximum sustainable yield work? In theory, it works. In practice, it's another matter. So I'm showing you this illustration, which is a fairly famous illustration from the ecological and fisheries literature, showing the trajectory of landings, of catches, of oceanic fishes across the world, from the tropics to high latitudes and from the various major oceans, the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, the Pacific, and so on. And what we see here is a consistent decline. In other words, in virtually all cases, these populations have not been managed to some sort of a maximum sustainable yield. That has been a very elusive goal in fisheries management. There are some pretty obvious reasons for why that is, and we can discuss those at the end if you're interested. Okay, so now I am going to move to age-structured populations. We've talked about density independence and density dependence. We've talked about discrete models versus continuous models. Talked a little bit about the difference between a deterministic approach and a stochastic approach to population models. Now I'm going to move into the next element of this, which is the addition of age structure. And age structure being nothing more than, as I said before, the fact that most species have organisms that are at different ages in that population, and those different age individuals have very different likelihoods of both reproducing and surviving through time. So here's some examples of some age-structured populations. This is a bowhead whale from the Arctic. These animals live to be probably in excess of 200 years. This is a bristlecone pine from the Great Basin Mountains of Eastern California. These are extremely long-lived organisms. They live thousands of years. They're the longest lived known individual tree, as far as I'm aware. This is a yellow-eyed rockfish. Yellow-eyed rockfish occur just north of our area here in the North Pacific. It's one of the larger of the rockfish species, really a magnificent animal. And these animals live to be at least 150 years old. So 150 years. And this is an aspen forest. And this is, in fact, a single organism. These are just what we call the ramets of a single genetical population. So these trees are all part of a single genetically identical individual. And these particular stands probably live to be thousands of years old. The individual trees, the individual trees that you see popping up here, can live to be about 150 years old, but the overall organism itself is very long-lived and very large. So the concept here is that for many organisms, most organisms, there are substantial differences in survival and reproduction for different ages or age classes or life stages. And the population growth rates are therefore going to depend on the age-specific birth and survival rates and the structure of the population. So imagine a human population in which every individual, in which we had the existing 8+ billion people on the face of the earth, but that every one of those individuals was post-reproductive. In that circumstance, despite the fact that we had 8 billion people, there would be no potential for future growth. That population would decline to extinction fairly quickly simply because of the nature of the age structure. Now, that doesn't happen in nature very often. It does happen occasionally in very small populations, but it doesn't happen very often. But you can see from that that the structure of the population, the relative number of individuals of the different ages or age classes in the population is going to be very important to how the overall population grows. And the way that we project these age structure populations is in a more complex way, because not only are we dealing now with a simple scalar value of the individuals, but we're dealing with a vector value, which has a whole bunch of different numbers in it that correspond with each age class in the population. And so we have to project that vector through time, and that requires the use of matrix algebra to do that. So we use matrix populations to project age structure populations. And I am not going to go into any of the details of that. I do when I teach population ecology, but that's not my point here. And I think that there are probably a fair number of you that maybe don't even know what a matrix is in mathematics, so I'm not going to bother with that. But I think you probably get the concept. I hope you do from what we're talking about here. So here's just an example of why age structure matters. And this is for an organism that's very dear to all of our hearts around here, the redwoods. All right. So for a redwood tree, a redwood seedling, a redwood does not produce viable seeds. So a newly growing redwood coming up from the forest floor doesn't produce viable seeds for more than 20 years. In other words, it takes 20 years for that individual organism to even begin to reproduce. Then, at some point, the number of viable seeds increases massively. And as the redwood becomes larger and larger, it can produce up to 6 million seeds per tree per year. So age matters from reproduction, from a reproductive standpoint. If you have a stand of a whole bunch of new seedling redwoods, there's going to be no more reproduction in that stand, at least sexual reproduction. If you have a stand that has a bunch of old trees, there's the capacity for continued seed production and continued regeneration. Survival also varies tremendously among different age classes of redwoods. So the yearly survival of a seed, or from the seed to the seedling stage, in other words, from a seed falling from a tree to 1 year later when it's a seedling, the probability of survival is less than 1 in 1,000. So almost all of those seeds die. A very few make it. Now move forward 20 years and imagine a tree that actually made it and grew to be over 20 years old. Now the probability of mortality is very low. In other words, that is specifically the probability, excuse me, the probability of mortality is almost zero. You know, I'm going to take a little break and just grab some water. Why don't we take our break right now? I'm going to run down. I'm not dying. I don't have corona or any of that. I just got something caught in my throat and I need to get a little bit of water. And I will be back, and then we'll pick up for the rest of the class after that. Okay? So if you want to unmute and chat for a few minutes, and then let's come back in 10 minutes. I can also pull my phone out and see what time it is, because I don't have any idea what time it is right now. Oh, yes, I do. It is 11:40. So let's come back at 11:50. All right? Sorry, I'll be right back. Thanks.
I'm trying to find out how to unmute everybody.
It was telling you.
Oh.
It said push shift command to unmute, but now it went away.
Let me see. Oh, cancel. I know what I'm going to do. All right. So if you want to say something, you can unmute yourself. So,
right in the bottom left corner.
Yeah. Right. Anybody? I don't actually see how I can unmute all of you. Looking up here in the Zoom thing. Mute all, but not unmute all. All right. Okay. Let's see.
What does it say in the more?
More. It says other things.
Oh, those are things for you to.
Yeah. Okay.
No.
All right.
Some people unmuted. Do they want to say anything?
Yeah. Okay. We have Jim, Roger. Okay. All right.
How many people? 28. So is that about?
It's about the same. Yeah. All right.
I'm back with my water.
Okay.
I thought I would simply ask if there are questions about any of that, because I can imagine that for some of you it was fairly, hopefully understandable, and maybe for some others less so. So I thought before maybe we jumped into moving forward that I could ask you about that.
Jim, one quick thing. In the last slide, you said the seedling survival rate was 0.001%. 1.0 would be 1%, right? So that means that the survival rate is 1 in 100,000.
1 in 100,000, yes, not one. Did I say 1 in 1,000? 0.0001.
Yeah,
I believe was what it was.
Yeah.
And for the post 20-year-old trees, it's 0.995. So they virtually no chance of dying once they get to that age, unless they get cut down by people. And on the other hand, they have virtually no chance of surviving when they're seeds. No, very, very low chance of surviving when they're seeds. So that's just I think a really good example of why age matters. It gives you a real clear sense for an organism that we're all familiar with about how different it can be.
How come none of those Australian sheep died off? They just kept growing.
They didn't. They stopped growing at about 5,500 sheep. And
after 80 years.
After 40 years. And then after 80 years, they were still at around that same level, right? So the reason is that that's the carrying capacity. the range can't hold any more than about 5,500 sheep. And so over time, during dry years, the number goes down, and during wet years, it may go up a little bit. But in the long term, the range can't handle any more than 5,500 sheep. So that's the carrying capacity. The birth rate and the death rate have become equal, and the population can't grow anymore.
I have a
What's the life
question.
expectancy?
Of sheep?
Yeah.
I have no idea. None. I think, you know, these are sheep that were probably just range sheep that were, and I think all they were doing with most of these sheep was shearing them. You know, they were just wool producers.
Yeah, they weren't eating them.
Yeah, and so, you know, they probably live for a while, but I don't know how long a sheep lives. You know, most ungulates, wild ungulates, don't live to be that old. 10 years or a little more is getting up there for them. And so my guess would be that most of those sheep don't live to be very much older than that, if that old at all, even. But I don't know. I'm not a sheep expert. I don't know. I'm sorry. I can't answer that question.
So there was one really big drop with the sheep. Would that have been related to some kind of a disease?
Could have been a disease, or it may very well have been a drought. You know, because in that particular part of the world, you get that's a very xeric or dry area. And so my guess is that they had a drought, and the drought caused a big reduction in the population.
Or
But-
fire.
So, Jim, the billion-dollar question, you got to have a chart also for the human population.
Oh, just hang on. We're going to get there.
All right.
If I hadn't gone into that coughing spasm, we would be there already. But
Yeah. Okay, I hold my fine.
that's coming up next.
Google says the average sheep lives about 11 years.
Oh, okay.
Oh, you looked it up. Okay.
Yes.
There you go. Well, I wasn't too far off. That's the average sheep. So that means some of them probably live to be 15 or 20, maybe
Yeah.
older.
These are the pets.
It's an interesting analysis that was just because there's this long time series of data. So that's why the sheep example, and it goes all the way back from a known introduction of an exact population size. So that Australian sheep example is unusual because of both the length of the records and the known starting point and size of the population.
Are you going to tell us about the marine mammal populations around here, since there's good data on that?
I am, but I'm not going to use any of those. I can tell you a little bit about the marine mammal populations here, and how all of the different common ones that you see are growing relative to carrying capacity. So for the three species that four species that are commonly seen along this coast. That would be sea otters, harbor seals, California sea lions, and elephant seals. The sea otter population is around carrying capacity. It is not growing because it has reached carrying capacity in Monterey Bay. The harbor seal populations, the sea lion populations, and elephant seal populations are all still increasing from a period of time when they were reduced to very low numbers because of harvest. And so they are all still in a growth phase.
Mm-hmm.
There is evidence for, at least for the sea lions, of fairly significant density dependence starting to act on those populations. The elephant seal populations are still increasing in overall number and still expanding in range. And so the elephant seals were very abundant up until into the the early 1800s, and then they were exploited for their blubber for oil, and they were hunted to the brink of extinction. They were in fact thought to be extinct back in the early 1900s, and the only known population of northern elephant seals at that time was on Guadalupe Island, Mexican island, south, 100 miles south of the border or so. So I think it was the California Academy of Sciences, it might have been some other organization, went out to Guadalupe Island, recognizing that there were virtually no elephant seals left, but that they wanted to make sure they had some specimens for the museum collection, and they killed every one of them.
Oh,
Every animal that was on the beach. That wasn't very many, there were 10 or so. Fortunately for the elephant seals, some of the juveniles were at sea. They weren't on the beach, and so they survived. They came back after that event and actually seeded the population that now has expanded from Guadalupe Island and spread north and has come up to Año Nuevo Island and gone to the Farallones and is now clear up into Oregon and southern Washington. So that's a little bit about the history of the elephant seal population.
What about whales? The humpback whale, many of them are now resident in Monterey Bay.
So humpback whales worldwide were reduced substantially during whaling, during the era of whaling. The populations in almost all cases are expanding. So our population here in Monterey Bay is actually not resident Monterey Bay. Some of these animals spend a lot of time here, but most of the humpback whales in Monterey Bay actually reproduce off Mexico and then move into Monterey Bay to feed during the summer. There are some that are here in the wintertime, but most of them move from Mexico to Monterey Bay. There's another stock that winters in Hawaii, and those are the ones that show up off Alaska in the summertime. And there are humpback whales in other parts of the world too. And all of those populations are doing quite well. Most of the large whales are increasing in numbers. There are a few examples of species that aren't. So for example, the North Atlantic right whale is not increasing. It's very small, it is declining. And we have a pretty good idea of why that is. It's mostly because of entanglement in fishing gear and ship strikes. There just are too many lines in the water and too much shipping activity to allow that population to reach a growing stage. The southern right whales, on the other hand, are doing pretty well. So in the southern hemisphere, right whales are increasing. As I said, most of the whales are now on the increase again. They have not reached carrying capacity, but some of them have become quite abundant again. So humpback whales are more abundant than they have been in decades. And they will continue to increase, at least for a while, I suspect, based on the current projections. Any other questions about whales or marine mammals or population growth? You know, in all of these cases, the details vary a little bit, but the essential principles that I talked about can be applied in understanding their population change. You know, they all apply in pretty much the same fundamental forms that of the processes that I was discussing.
Yeah, and you know, I would like to offer also, I think when you look at corporations as a living organism, they grow also, showing that the curve, and then they come to a point in where density dependent, and then they flatten out, and they have some standard deviation from that, but it continuously sort of more.
Yeah.
Because companies die, but you see pretty much, and you can see that in stock markets. I think you can almost apply your formula for stocks for new companies.
You can take these simple growth models that I gave you and apply them to your bank accounts. I mean, your interest rates work just like the reproduction of population. Our population, there isn't a death function to it except to the degree that you spend money. But as long as you're earning money at a higher rate than you're spending it, it's going to grow, and you can calculate exactly what your holding is going to be, with the population size of your wealth in an identical way. And for anyone that's interested, any of you that have well, either a Mac or a PC that has the standard desktop software on it, you will have an Excel spreadsheet piece of software, and you can use that Excel to actually do all kinds of amazing things. and create these same kinds of models that I've shown you, and you can do all kinds of stuff with them. So if anyone's interested in that, I can explain to you how to do it. It's very, very easy, actually. Okay, so we move ahead.
Yep.
All right, I'm there. Okay, could the rest of you, or I don't know that it's that important, but just mute your microphones. Okay, so I want to move now to another related concept, and this simply has to do with the form of the likelihood of survival over the lifespan of an individual. And this is called the survivorship function, all right? And it dictates the age structure of a population. So the probability of survival from birth to some age, X we'll call it, whatever it happens to be, is referred to as the survivorship, and it is characterized by this term LX. And LX simply equals the number of individuals in the population of age X divided by the number of individuals in the population that were just born, all right? So LX is going to vary from 1 when X equals 0, that is right at the moment of birth, to 0 when X is maximum longevity, all right? When X is as old as an organism can get, then LX is going to equal 0. So the LX curve will be what we call a monotonically declining curve that will always range from 1 when age is 0 to 0 when age is maximum, all right? And these LX curves take very different functions depending upon the life history of different organisms, all right? So this is simply a plot from the ecology text that I used when I taught ecology that shows how these LX curves, these survivorship curves, can vary in form from birth to maximum longevity, all right? And they basically take 3 different general forms. One is what we call a type 1 survivorship curve. A type 1 survivorship curve is a survivorship function where the probability of death following birth is very low for quite a long time and then accelerates as organisms become quite old. So this is the kind of a survivorship curve that applies to humans. A type 3 survivorship curve is just the opposite of that. It's like a redwood. It's very high mortality early in life, and then once an organism reaches some older age, its probability of mortality becomes lower and lower, very low. So it takes this form, type 3. And then there is what we call the type 2 survivorship curve. And a type 2 survivorship curve is simply the form of survivorship when mortality is independent of age. In other words, the likelihood of dying is the same at any particular point in life, all right? So these are the 3 fundamental forms of survivorship curves. And what I'm going to show you are some data from 3 different kinds of organisms that have different survivorship curves. So these are data from bighorn sheep. Bighorn sheep live to an age of about 15 years old or so. That's about the maximum that they ever achieve. And if you look at the survivorship curve of bighorn sheep, you can see that the chances of mortality are quite low until you reach an age of about 9 or 10, and then it goes way up very rapidly. So that creates this type 1 survivorship curve. These are some data from birds. This happens to be, I think, a meadowlark, and their studies of survival of these species in nature. And this particular survivorship curve is pretty straight. In other words, it's a type 2 survivorship. And this is characteristic of a lot of passerine birds. Passerine birds, once they've fledged from the nest, their chances of survival are fairly constant through life until they die. And this is a survivorship curve from a tree, a plant of some kind. I don't know what it is. It came from the text, but they're real data. And this shows just a very strong type 3 survivorship pattern where the probability of survival for the early moments of life or the early years of life is extremely low, as it was in the Redwood example, and then it becomes higher and higher as time goes on to maximum longevity. So that's survivorship, and it gives you a sense of how different species can be in their life history characteristics, the way that they are born and die through time. So now, human population growth. I want to move into something that you're all interested in. I think you've all heard about. Is a big issue, a big point of interest and concern for everyone on the earth, and that is human population growth. So first I want to talk about the age structure of human populations. These vary a lot in different parts of the world. So these are age structure plots, and all it shows is the proportion of the population at different ages from birth at the bottom to maximum longevity at the top. And on one side of the curve are the females, and on the other side of the curve are the males. All right, so that's just the way these were plotted. And we have 3 different human age structures. One for Mexico, which is a very rapidly growing population. One for Europe, this happens to be for Sweden, which is a population that's not growing at all. You can see how different the age structure is between Mexico and Sweden as a consequence of that. Or the age structure is really a consequence of their reduced growth rate. And in between, to some degree in between, which is the United States, which is a growing but much slower growing population. And in the US, you can also see some interesting little blips here that have to do with, for example, the war and that sort of thing. There are demographic signatures of these major mortality and reproductive periods through time in these age structures. So here's a plot of the abundance of humans on Earth, estimated, of course, since we didn't have a census back 2.5 million years ago, but an estimate of how many people were on the face of the Earth in billions through time. And the red just shows, so that you can see that plot. So what you can see is that some species that we recognized as something similar to Homo sapiens showed up some while back. A couple million years ago, maybe less. And that population hardly changed at all for thousands of years, right? And you can actually see in this plot some major historical events like the plague and things of that nature. But beginning with the Industrial Revolution, that plot changed dramatically to the modern age. So here is the same, the data, sort of the same data plotted over a different time scale. This is simply a 2,000-year time scale. In other words, this runs from about the time of Christ to 2000, to about roughly the present time. This is a log plot. So if the rate of growth were constant, this plot ought to be linear. And the line that's shown here is in fact the projection of how big the human population ought to be if the early intrinsic rate of growth had remained constant. The points and the connecting dots show what actually happened. So in this particular case, we have what we call super exponential population growth. The population rate of increase has become higher and higher and higher through time. And so you can see here population sizes and the doubling times of the human population because of this super exponential population growth. There are no other populations that I am aware of on the surface of the earth of any species that have grown consistently in a super exponential manner like humans have. This growth in the human population has not been contributed equally by all parts of the world. You'll be no surprise to you. And this map actually shows the rate of population growth for a period of time. This is from 1990 to 1995 of the different major countries around the world. And the darker the colors, the higher the rates of population growth. So you can see, you know, there are a few large land masses where there are either no people or we have no data. So Antarctica, there's virtually no one living there except for a few outposts. And Greenland, there are no data. But everywhere else we have, pretty much everywhere else we have data. And what you can see is that there are places like Europe and Russia that have actually a very low intrinsic rate of population growth over that period of time. There are other places like the United States and Canada and Brazil and Argentina and Australia and parts of China where the population growth is somewhat higher. There are places like India and other parts of South America and Mexico where the population growth, darker green, is somewhat higher yet. And then there are places where the population growth is very high. And the centers, major centers of very high population growth in the world today are Africa and the Middle East. That's what is contributing most of the recruitment of the high rate of growth in the human population. So it's a pretty interesting graph to give you a sense of kind of where people are coming from, so to speak. This is another figure that just shows the difference in birth rates and death rates through time, starting back in the 1700s up until the change of the new millennium, between less developed countries and what we call the more developed countries. And what you can see in the case of the less developed countries is that the birth rate remained very high up until not very long ago, just a few decades ago, and then it started to go down. The death rate also remained very high, but has fallen dramatically. In the case of the more developed countries, there's been a more gradual reduction in the birth rate and a more gradual reduction in the death rate, so that the difference today between the birth rate and the death rate in more developed countries is much smaller than the difference in the birth rate between in the less developed countries. These less developed countries are the ones that are still growing rapidly. So Africa and much of the Middle East falls into this group. So this is a projection. Here we are, not too long ago, world population of 6.1 billion at the millennium, I guess is when it was. And this is a projection that human demographers have created to estimate how many people there will be in the world in another 100 years or a little more. And the estimates that these people have come up with is that the human population will stabilize at about 11 billion. That's what they estimate. This is based on simply the assumption that the less developed countries will become more like the more developed countries, and that is going to be what dictates projection of populations. These are projections by human demographers. There are a number of ecologists, myself included, that are very skeptical of this projection and are somewhat skeptical of the assumption that this is a sustainable carrying capacity. Okay, so now I'm going to move from this discussion of human population growth, which is an offshoot of our discussion of age-structured populations, to the last area of discussion, which is population growth with versus without species interactions. So all of the discussion that we have had to this point has imagined populations being limited by nothing more than the environment that they are living in. All right, that was when they are limited, it is strictly because of the resources that are available for them in the environment that they live in. But that's not the way it is in nature. in nature, there are interactions between species. Species compete with one another, species eat one another, and those competitive interactions and those consumer-prey interactions can have a big impact on the size of both of the populations that are involved in these interactions. So what I want to do now is going to move on and show you these slightly more complex situations where we have species interactions involved in population models, and what some of the interesting outcomes are from the models that begin to involve species interactions. Right? They become very interesting when we add species interactions. And I'm going to try to kind of lead you through the fundamentals of how these things work and why they're interesting. So we're going to talk about two kinds of species interactions in this subsequent discussion. One of them is going to be competition, and the other is going to be predator-prey or consumer-prey interactions. I'll also call this predators and victims or consumers and victims. And in the case of competition, I'll be referring to them as the competitors, the two different competitors. So what is competition? Just imagine that there are two species living together in some place in the world, and that they have a negative effect on one another because they are wanting to consume the same resource, all right? So any two species that are being supported by the same resource have the capacity to compete with one another. And that those interaction effects, the influence of species 1 on species 2, or species A on species B, however you want to refer to them, is going to be negative, because species A is going to be consuming some of the resources that species B would otherwise be consuming. And similarly, the effect of species B on species A is going to be negative, because species B is going to be consuming some of the resources that species A would otherwise be consuming. So in these competition models, the effects of two species on one another are going to be negative. They are going to tend to cause the populations to grow at different reduced rates usually. So here is a graph from a classic study in competition. This was done back in the early 1900s by a Russian population biologist by the name of Gausa. And Gausa did a really simple laboratory experiment. He worked with these single-celled organisms that are really easy to raise and grow in the laboratory, called paramecium. And any of you that have ever looked at pond water or have taken an introductory biology course know about what paramecia are. Well, parameciums come in different flavors, that is, different species, all right? And so what Gausa did was simply grow these paramecium species both separately and in mixed cultures. So he had two species that he worked with. One was Paramecium aurelia, and the other was Paramecium caudatum. These are the two species that he worked with. And when he grew Paramecium aurelia in isolation of any other species, it grew in a form that was very characteristic of typical logistic growth. This is just exactly the form of the curve that I showed you earlier for what happens when resources become limiting. When he grew Paramecium aurelia with the potential competitor, Paramecium caudatum, what he saw was that the Paramecium aurelia continued to grow logistically, but just at a lower carrying capacity. And the explanation for this is that this is an effect of competition, that the competitive effect of the other species is reducing the carrying capacity of Paramecium aurelia. He did the converse experiment, and this is what was really interesting. He did the converse experiment where he grew Paramecium caudatum in isolation, and he got virtually the same growth curve as he did for Paramecium aurelia. All right, in other words, it grew logistically, it grew in a density-dependent manner and achieved a carrying capacity. But when he added Paramecium aurelia to the Paramecium caudatum cultures, Paramecium caudatum began to grow, and then it declined to extinction. So these two situations are really different from one another, and it begs the question, what is going on here that makes these two species capable of coexisting when they're competing. And in this case, one species causing the other species to become extinct. It's a cool question. And so now I'm going to go through the theory that was developed to explain this, all right? And that theory involves modeling two competing species instead of simply one, which is everything we've talked about so far. Everything we've talked about so far has involved a model of just one species, population of one species. Now we have two populations of two different species living together. So I'm going to start out with this same simple differential equation for density-dependent growth, and I'm just going to write it twice, one for species 1, which is indicated by the subscript 1 here. It's going to have a particular size, n sub 1. It's going to have a particular growth rate, r sub 1. It's going to have a particular carrying capacity and isolation of species 2, k sub 1, and so on and so forth. Same thing for species 2. So we have now two equations instead of one, and we want to join those in some way, all right? And the way that we join them, the way that we add competition to this otherwise situation where there is no competition is simply in the following manner. We discount the numerator of this density-dependent component of this equation by a further effect of species 2 on species 1, all right? So not only do we have density dependence going on here that is a function of species 1 becoming larger and larger and larger relative to its carrying capacity, but that effect is being added to by some additional effect of species 2, and we simply multiply the abundance of species 2 by a per capita parameter. This is called the competition coefficient for species 2 on species 1. Subtract that, and that gives us a way of actually projecting the dynamics and the size of population of species 1 through time. And we can do exactly the same thing for species 2. We just use a different form, a different competition coefficient, because this is now the competition coefficient of species 1 on species 2, and that's going to have to be multiplied by the abundance of species 1, all right? So that's all we do. We just make these things work that way. Now, in this particular case, when there is no competition, there is a single equilibrium point here. There's a single value of N1 that will result in a 0 population growth rate. And that occurs when N1 equals K1. In other words, when the population reaches carrying capacity, the rate of population change is going to reach 0. It's going to stop growing, all right? When we do this, when we move into this more complex situation, there's going to be a whole series of values that are going to result in this population stopping growth, ceasing to grow. And those values are going to vary depending upon the size of species 2, population of species 2, all right? Same thing with species 1. Species 1 becomes more and more abundant. The size of species 2 that is going to result in an equilibrium is going to continue to vary. There's not going to just be a single value. So instead of that single value, we have what we call an isocline. The isocline is just all potential values of species 2 that result in 0 population growth at all of the possible values of the abundance of species 1. And the line is actually very easy to calculate because you can define it where the abundance of species 1 equals 0. And when you put that into this equation, when species 1 equals 0, this part becomes 0. And so the equilibrium value of species 2 becomes the carrying capacity of species 2. Similarly, you can go down and say when the value, when the abundance of species 2 equals 0, how many species 1 should there be? And you can solve this equation the same way. And that turns out to be this value. So now you have 2 points, and when you have 2 points, you can draw a straight line through all the rest of them, and this gives you the isocline. So this is sort of the magic of what the population biologists started to come up with as a way of figuring out how two competing species can interact with one another. So this is the exercise for species 2. I created what we call the isocline. It's a line, a whole series, an infinitely large number of values, which depending upon how many individuals of species 1 are in the population, define the abundance of species 2 at which growth will cease. Population growth will cease. You can do the exact same thing for species 2, or sorry, species 1, all right? And that I've done that here, all right? So when the abundance of species 2 is below this isocline, the population will grow. When the abundance of species 2 is above the isocline, it will decline. Same thing for species 1. When the abundance of species 1 is below the isocline, its numbers will increase. When the abundance is above the isocline, its abundance will decline. So now the only remaining step is to put these two together and ask the question, how many are there of both? And there are 4 possibilities for the way that we can line up these isoclines. The isocline for species 1 can be consistently higher than that of species 2. Vice versa, 2 can be higher than 1. And they can cross in 2 different ways. And they can cross in these 2 different ways that I've drawn here, all right? Under this circumstance, species 1 always wins. Species 2 declines to extinction all the time. Under this circumstance, species 2 always wins. Species 1 declines to extinction all the time. In this circumstance, case 3, we have the 2 lines crossing. And where those 2 lines cross, we have the capacity for coexistence. So this is an explanation for what must have gone on in the paramecium example, where the 2 species were able to coexist with one another. And one or the other of these examples is the case of what happened when one species drove the other species to extinction. And in the final case, which is an interesting one, we have an equilibrium condition where these lines cross one another, but they do so in an unstable way. So this is an equilibrium, but any slight deviation from that equilibrium will cause the system to run out of control toward either this red point or to this blue point, and the other species will go extinct. And so depending upon where you start, one species will drive the other to extinction, or the other species will drive the first species to extinction. And it depends on where you start in this space as to what the outcome is. So the interesting outcome of all of this is that when you add competition to these equations, you get very complicated dynamics that result from them. Field studies of competition. People have done some, and I just want to tell you a little bit about some of the classic studies that have been done on competitors, on competition in nature, where coexistence seems to have occurred. And what you have seen from the mathematics, from the theory that I have gone through, is that it's very difficult for 2 species to coexist with one another. The more likely outcome is that one species is going to drive the other species extinct. So this is just a summary of some of the early work by one of the most famous of our modern ecologists. This was Robert MacArthur, who was at Princeton. MacArthur was very interested in birds. He worked on birds, and he worked a lot on competition in birds. And what he discovered in doing very detailed observations of mostly warblers in northeastern deciduous forests is that these warblers separate out where they occur in the trees in very different ways. And his argument was that they avoid driving one another to extinction by having evolved these very subtle differences in the parts of the trees that they can live in. So that was some of MacArthur's work and findings that kind of grew out of this theory that had preceded him about competition and how competition worked in nature. This is another classic example of competition, work by Joe Connell, who's at UC Santa Barbara. And Connell did work on barnacles. He studied in barnacles in the British Isles, and he did some experiments of two species of barnacles that coexist with one another in the intertidal community, the rocky intertidal community, but in a zonal manner. So you have one species of barnacle that occurs low in the intertidal, you have another species of barnacle that occurs high in the intertidal. And what he showed was that this boundary between the two species is driven by competition. So if you remove the lower species, the higher species moves down in the intertidal. On the other hand, if you remove the higher species, the lower species does not move up. And that's because this lower species, its upward distribution is limited by physical stress. So Connell's experiments, his simple experiments on barnacles, demonstrate some of the nuance, the complexity of the importance of competition in influencing the distribution and abundance of species in nature. I'm going to move now to the last part of species interactions, which is predator-prey or consumer-prey or consumer-victim interactions. And the nature of a consumer-victim interaction is fundamentally different than the nature of a competitive interaction. In a competitive interaction, the species both have negative effects on one another. In a consumer-prey interaction, the consumer has a negative effect on the prey has a positive effect on the consumer. The prey is fueling the consumer is killing the prey. So this is a positive negative type interaction, very different from the competitive interaction. And so the models that have been built for the dynamics of consumer prey interactions grow out of this very different fundamental dynamic of the nature of the species interaction. So why are consumer prey interactions particularly interesting? They're particularly interesting and important because consumerism, predation, is ubiquitous throughout all of nature. Every living organism has a predator of some sort or another. Every species of animal has to be nourished by consuming something, some other prey, whether it be a plant or some higher species above that plant. So consumer prey interactions are absolutely fundamental to the operation of the living world. And so their interaction, the nature of their interaction in population biology becomes very interesting to us. In addition, predators can limit populations. They can have an impact on the nature of competitive interactions. They can influence the behavior of species and so on and so forth. So predation is a very powerful and important force in nature. And those reasons are why it's interesting and important to study and to understand the dynamics of predator-prey interactions. So how do we do that? We do it in basically exactly the same way that the people that have studied competition have done it. That is, creating models to understand process. And in these cases, the models try to reconstruct process dynamics for both the predators and the victims. And people do field studies. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of both. And in our discussion of the field studies, I'm going to start to segue into what will be the remainder of this course, which will be in communities and ecosystems. So without going into the details, one can do exactly the same thing with a predator and prey as one could do with two competitors. And that is, one can create an isocline for the abundance of the victim and for the abundance of the predator. And so the victim abundance is going to remain at some particular level when the number of predators is just right. When the number of predators becomes too large, the number of victims will decline. When the number of predators becomes smaller, the number of victims can increase. And so this equilibrium value for victim abundance, which is what we call a victim isocline, is driven by the abundance of predators. And it will look like this in this graph of predators versus victims. Similarly, victims are going to do the same thing, all right? In the case of the number of or sorry, this was the number of victims, how the victims were going to vary as a function of predator abundance. This is the way the number of predators are going to vary as a function of victim abundance. So when the victims are rare, predators are going to starve, they're going to decline. When victims are very abundant, predators are going to are not going to starve, there's going to be plenty for them to eat, and they're going to increase. And at some particular value, that's going to reach an equilibrium, and that's going to be called the predator isocline, this red line. That particular abundance of victims is going to determine the abundance of predators that can be sustained at equilibrium, the carrying capacity, so to speak, of the predators in that system. So just like in the competition models, we now throw these two isoclines together to look at the dynamics of predator-prey interactions. So we put the victim isocline and the predator isocline together in a single graph, and the point at which these cross will be an equilibrium. In other words, this will be the abundance of both predator and prey, where both the predators and prey stabilize, in theory. The problem is that if you deviate into any one of these four quadrants in this graph, the tendency is going to not be to move back toward that equilibrium, but to move perpendicular to that equilibrium. So if, let's say, we are exactly at this equilibrium and the system gets perturbed out here where the victims become more abundant and the predators become more abundant, then the joint abundance of victims and predators is going to move in this direction. They're going to move from the lower right to the upper left. In this case, they're going to move from the upper right to the lower left. In this case, they're going to move from the upper left to the lower right, and so on. And that's going to actually create a stable limit cycle. It's going to create cyclicity. It's going to create oscillations in the abundance of predators and victims. So this just shows you what happens in these perturbations into these different quadrants. And so while this is a theoretical equilibrium point, it's never really realized. Instead, we see predator-prey dynamics in theory behaving as a stable limit cycle, varying constantly through time, just isolating, cycling over and over and over again. Does that happen in nature? And this is the theoretical prediction of how we would expect a victim population to change in abundance through time using this predator-prey model. And this is the complementary prediction of how we would expect the predator to change in abundance through time using that same predator-prey model. And in running those models, it turns out that the predator population cycles by lagging the victim population by 1/4 of a cycle. In other words, this is a cycle from here to here, and the predator population will lag the victim population by 1/4 of a cycle. Does that happen? Yes, it actually does. And here are a couple of examples. So this is some really classic work that was done by a famous Finnish ecologist, Ilkka Hanski. Hanski died a couple of years ago. He was a very influential person in population and evolutionary biology. And these are just some data from a paper that he published 30 years or so ago, showing the abundance of rodents. This is the predator-prey system here, are weasels eating rodents. So here are data over a period of decades showing the abundance of rodents. And you can see that they are going up and down and up and down and up and down. They are cycling just like the model would predict. And here are comparable or complementary data on the abundance of weasels during those same periods of time. And from this, you can see that, in fact, the weasel populations are cycling as well, but they are slightly displaced to the right, roughly 1/4 cycle, as theory would predict. So this interesting descriptive study is very consistent with the dynamics of the predator-prey model and captures a well-known dynamic of predator-prey systems to oscillate and to cycle through time. Here's another famous example. This is mostly an example that was done. The leader of a lot of this work was Charlie Krebs at the University of British Columbia. And what this shows is the abundance of snowshoe hare and lynx in Canada over a period of a century. How was it that they got these data? They were able to get these data from the trapping records of the Hudson Bay Company. So they were actually able to go back and estimate the relative abundance of lynx in the system, given how many furs were produced or marketed by the Hudson Bay Trapping Company. So that's how a lot of these data were gathered. And in this particular case, when we look at the lynx versus hare abundance, we see a very similar concordance in very strong cyclic behavior of the two populations. And the indications, again, are that the lynx population is slightly advanced in its cyclicity, or delayed, I guess, in its cyclicity behind the hare populations. So remarkably, that simple model seems to explain a lot about how nature works under certain circumstances. Okay, so this has all been theory. I'm hoping that much of it has been theory. It's been theory kind of directed toward asking questions about how particular population changes occur in nature under different circumstances. And now what I want to do is just move to some field examples of work on predators and prey that I think are particularly interesting. And one of them, which will be of interest to all of you, just because big animals in Africa are cool and interesting, is some of the classic work done by Tony Sinclair. Tony Sinclair is a professor, he's retired now, professor at the University of British Columbia, and he spent his entire life working in the Serengeti on large animals and on the predator-prey and ecological dynamics of that system. These are the players. These are the species. Here are the predators. So there are a whole bunch of them. The interesting thing about Africa is that there are a bunch of different species. Everything from the smallest one in his system, which is the golden jackal, silver jackals, wild dog, cheetah, up to the very biggest, which are the lions, leopards, spotted hyenas, but the lions are the largest. The prey, similarly, are diverse and vary quite a bit in body size. So the prey in this system range everything from the oribi, which is a very small bovid ungulate, to things like elephants and hippos and rhinos, and everything in between in terms of body size, impalas and topis and zebra and wildebeest and buffalo and giraffe and so on and so forth. So Tony spent his lifetime working on the details of the way these species interact with one another. And here is a graph from an accumulation of work that he did over the decades, which shows the weight of the prey, the size of the prey item for each of these major predators in the system, starting with the golden jackal, the smallest one at the top, going down to the lion at the bottom. And so this is a range of the prey size of the lion, and this is a range of the prey size of the golden jackal. And as you can see, the golden jackal only eats very small prey. The larger the species of predator, the bigger the range and the larger the maximum size of the prey, up to the lion, which eats the very biggest, which can kill organisms that are over 500 kilograms in body mass, big things. Here is another really interesting summary figure from Sinclair's work, which shows the number of predators that a particular prey species has as a function of that prey species body mass. Again, starting with the oribi as the very smallest to the biggest, which are rhino, hippo, and elephant. All right, and as you can see, if you're a small prey in this system, you've got to be afraid of virtually everything. And if you're a big prey in this system, you have to be afraid of almost nothing. And this is the final figure that I'm going to show you from Sinclair's work, which shows the proportion of deaths that occur in the population through time, of overall deaths of all of these different prey species that are a consequence of being eaten by your predators. So this is the oribi, the smallest one over on the left here with the O, impala next, and so on and so forth, out to rhino, hippo, and elephant are H and E. And this is a measure of the number of the deaths that occur in that population through time that are a consequence of being eaten by one of your predators. And for the smallest things, every death is a result of predation. To the largest things, none of them are. So I'm going to end with a segue into some of the work that I've been involved with. This is going to be just a brief recounting, because it involves predator-prey interactions, of one of my former graduate students, Jane Watson, who just retired last year, which gives you some sense of my own sort of longevity. But Jane is a Canadian, and she has spent much of her life working on Vancouver Island. And she's been interested in sea otter prey relationships. So the two species that I'm going to talk about here from her work are just the predator, which is the sea otter, and the prey, which is this red sea urchin. All right. We'll talk more about these in a little different capacity in the final discussion, when we talk about food webs and trophic cascades and complex species interactions. So these are some data from Jane's long-term work. She started in 1988, and she worked at 3 different sites. One was Barkley Sound, which is in the southern western coast of Vancouver Island. And Barkley Sound is a place where there have been no otters through this whole 20-year period, from 1988 through 2007. The second place that she worked was in Checklesset Bay, which is way on the north coast of Vancouver Island. That's in the magenta here. And Checklesset Bay is a place where otters were reintroduced in the 1960s and early 1970s onto the coast of Vancouver Island following their extermination from the fur trade. And they were abundant throughout this entire time that she studied at this site. And you can see that the abundance of urchins between sites where otters were abundant and sites where otters were absent are very, very different. Virtually zero when the otters were abundant. High densities, these are 7, 8 to 10 individuals per meter square of seafloor, where otters were absent in Barkley Sound. And the third place, which is really interesting, is Cayucet Bay. And during the period of Jane's work, Cayucet Bay was invaded by this population from Checklesset Bay that was spreading southward. So it became invaded by the otters, and you can see that that invasion drove the abundance of urchins from what you see in this otter-free system to what you see in this otter-abundant system. So this is probably one of the most powerful data sets that we have of variation in both time and space to show the impact of a large predator on its prey population. So this leads to the next level of complexity, which is what we call indirect effects. These are direct effects. They're direct effects of an otter on urchins. There's no intervening species. Urchins eat things like kelp, and so there is an indirect effect because of that of the otters on the kelp. And this leads to the notion of some things we're going to talk about next time, which is the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So if you are a kelp, your enemy is a sea urchin, but the sea urchin's enemy is the otter, and so the otter is the friend of the kelp. So a shared predator can also make it appear that a couple of species compete with one another when they really don't. This is called apparent competition. This is a complex interaction that I'll maybe talk a little bit about next time. I haven't put the next week's class completely together yet. Predators can reverse competitive exclusion, so they can intercede in a system and prevent one species from competitively exterminating another. And predators can enhance lower trophic level species like plants. So for example, the otter, urchin, kelp indirect interaction is what we call a trophic cascade. And I'll talk about trophic cascades, probably drawing fairly heavily from our own work on otters and urchins, but examples from other systems around the world in the 4th class session that we do next time. So I'm at the end, or very close to the end. I don't know what time it is, but it's time for me to go pretty soon here. And I just want to go back and hit the high points of what we did today, and then we can have some discussion. We talked about a definition of a biological population, what it is, a group of interconnected, usually by reproduction, organisms. We talked about population growth models, how we use simple mathematical and graphical models to characterize process in demography, that is, to characterize the growth and decline of populations. We talked about the concept of density dependence being a phenomenon that occurs when the abundance of a population reaches such a level that either the birth rate declines or the death rate increases, or some combination of the two happens with increasing population size that stops further population growth. That's the simple notion of density dependence. Talked a little bit about how density dependent models and the concept of density dependence is used in natural resource management and for achieving a goal of a sustainable yield where we are wanting to derive some benefit from a living population of, say, fish or timber or wildlife or something of that sort. And how we use this notion of sustainable yield and population models to determine what that harvest rate ought to be to achieve that. We talked about age-structured populations and why age structure is important. Talked about the notion of survivorship and the difference between type 1, type 2, and type 3 survivorship profiles for different species. Discussed the notion of competition and how competition is brought into population models to actually model the dynamics of competing species. Then move to consumer-prey interactions. I talked about how consumer-prey interactions are brought together in models to model the dynamics of predator-prey, predator-victim interactions, how these commonly lead to cyclic dynamics in both the predators and the prey. And then I talked a little bit about some of the field studies of people like Ilkka Hansky, Charlie Krebs, and Tony Sinclair, their work in Finland and on the snowshoe hare lynx, and Tony's work in Africa on large mammals and predator-prey interactions. And by the way, Tony was also a key member of the Krebs group in working on the snowshoe hare work too. So he's a giant. And that is it for today. I hope I didn't leave you completely befuddled. Happy to hang around here for a while, answer questions or whatever, and then I'll see you again next week. So I think what we'll do is we'll go back to the regular screen here. Let me log out of this and we can have some discussion to the degree that you wish, okay?
Okay, and you can unmute yourself if you have a question. So questions for Jim? Just unmute yourself and go ahead. Linda?
She's trying to unmute herself.
I have a comment.
Go ahead.
This has been such an excellent course. I wish I had taken this class when I was younger.
You know, unless you're Einstein, time doesn't go backwards. Pretty much you have to, you're gonna have to live with what you've got, but you know, there's all this time in front of us to learn and do things. And,
Thanks to Ollie, we're able to do that.
yeah.
Okay, well, I got one, Jim. In the survivorship curves, you showed that odd pattern for birds where your chance of surviving is kind of independent. So is that must be predators are killing these birds? I mean, just a random chance if you're going to walk out and get hit by a car or get eaten by a Cooper's hawk. I mean, and if so, you'd expect that like those little antelope that you said that almost always die by getting eaten, that they'd have a similar survivorship curve. Is that correct?
Well, the latter, I don't know the answer to the latter part of your question. It makes sense, and it wouldn't surprise me, and I probably could find out. I know a lot of people that have worked in the African system that know those animals well, including Tony, who's a good friend of mine, so I could ask. Yes, so the data for the birds is really a little bit of not quite right. It doesn't, the survivorship that is shown does not extend from birth to death. It extends from the age of first reproduction to death. So once they start nesting, then their probability of survival becomes more or less independent of age. And it's probably because the likelihood of that nest being discovered and destroyed and that animal dying as a process in the process of that happening is pretty much independent of age. And predation is a common form of death in small birds. So yes, I think you're right on that. You know, there has been a lot of debate, a lot of analysis and work done on passerine birds and what it is that's driving their populations to change as they are. And consequently, a lot of that work is focused on the details of the demography of populations and the survival of individuals. So there's actually a fair amount of controversy and complexity to the data on what's going on with different bird populations in different areas. There are examples of studies that have been done in places where exotic predators come into a system, in particular snakes, and how that has had big effects on the survival of nesting birds. Cats as well. They have a big effect. And so predation is, I think you're right. And in the nature, in those particular animals, age just doesn't have much of an independent effect on mortality. And so that's why you get that more or less linear form of survivorship there. It's not common in nature. It's more typical that species either have a type 1 or type 3 survivorship curve. So it's not really all that common to see a species with sort of a general classic type 2 survivorship curve. Birds are just one example of things that live that way, but most other things don't.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Some years ago, there was a lot of talk and excitement about the idea that large mammals in the Americas became extinct when humans migrated into the Americas about 15,000 years ago, and that it was that predation which caused these extinctions. Is that still correct? Is that still the point of view, and is that understood any better today?
Yes and yes. But also it has always been a very controversial, I could do a whole course on this. So that idea that you're referring to about the megafaunal extinction in the New World was an idea that was put forth in the late 1960s by Paul Martin. Paul Martin was a geochronologist, ecologist, paleontologist at the University of Arizona. And he was the one that looked at nature and said, it must have been people that did this. It was subsequently a very controversial idea. It was sort of embraced with some skepticism by ecologists and biologists, and it was roundly rejected by most human anthropologists and paleontologists. In the 50 years that have proceeded since Martin's first discovery and his paper, and incidentally, the paper, if you're interested in reading it and have access to the library, It's a paper that was in Science in, I think, 1968, called The Discovery of America by Paul Martin, where he put that idea forward. In my opinion, and in the opinion of most people, the evidence for human overkill being a cause of large body-side animal extinctions is fairly widely accepted now. And I think the main thing that turned the tide was when the focus shifted from exclusively North American, and the problem was with the North American focus was that the extinction event co-occurred with two other major environmental changes. One of them was the arrival of humans to the New World, and the other was the shift in climate from the last ice age to the present. And so, you know, there were people for a long time that were arguing that it was the ice age and that all of the climate and land changes and vegetation and one thing or another that co-occurred with that radical environmental change that caused species to go extinct. Martin's argument, and I think what motivated him, I knew Martin pretty well, and I've talked to him a lot over the years before he died. And what motivated his thinking more than anything else, I think, was the question that if that's true, and we had all of these glacial interglacial cycles during the Pleistocene, why didn't they go extinct before? Why was it that last one that resulted in this huge loss? Roughly 50% of the large-bodied mammal species in the New World disappeared at that time, very abruptly. So, you know, he also looked at plants and small mammals. He was a paleontologist. He did a lot of plant-related work as well. And he said, you know, we don't see the same pattern in the plants, and we don't see the same pattern in the small-bodied animals. We just see it in these big animals. And so based on those two general points of logic, he argued that it was most likely people that did it. The thing that's happened subsequently that I think has added weight to the general view is looking elsewhere around the world. So since Martin's analysis of the New World, Americas, people have looked at the patterns of large animal extinctions in Australia, which happened just as they did in North America, but at a very different time. So in Australia, the extinctions started to occur about 30,000 years ago, which also was more or less coincident with the peopling of Australia. In other parts of the world, especially small islands in the Caribbean, or large islands, I should say, in the Caribbean and in Oceania, New Zealand and places like that, a lot of the big species like moas and so on went extinct roughly at about the time that those areas were peopled, but that those timings were all independent of one another. And so that body of collective evidence, I think, has really led the community, most people in the community, to embrace Martin's view on that hypothesis that there's probably a lot of truth in it. That said, it's still a hugely hot button issue. You know, it's still something. I was just talking to one of my colleagues at Berkeley a couple of days ago on the phone, and she was their neighbor is somebody, an archaeologist or anthropologist or something, and they got into this raging argument about Martin's hypothesis again. You know, here we are 50 years later. So some of these things just don't die easily. And that's a very long answer to your question, but I think that the strong weight of evidence by most reasonable people, interpretations by most reasonable people, is that idea is correct. The big question mark that the critics put out there is they said we don't find any evidence for overkill. We don't find a lot of material that would indicate animals being butchered and that sort of thing. And it's true that there isn't a great deal of physical evidence for overkill, but there's been a lot of analysis subsequently done, mostly by archaeologists, more quantitative, statistically oriented archaeologists, where people have tried to create a profile of what you would expect to see in the way of these remains under different scenarios, and in particular, if overkill happened, what would you expect to see in the archaeological record over the last 10,000 years? And that expectation is, in most cases, virtually nothing. And so that's turned a lot of people more toward embracement of that view. So that's my view. I feel obviously fairly strongly about it. I've thought about it, looked at it for a long, long time, and I feel that there's an awful lot of evidence in support of it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good question. Anyone else?
Well,
You had a question? Gunther?
yeah, thank you very much, Jim. It was very interesting.
Sure.
And my reflection is, you know, the humans are the biggest predators on Earth, and the prey is the total global planet. And when you showed the population growth to, some people think it's going to 11 million, you appeared to be a little bit skeptical about that. So my question is whether environmentalists can help the environment, whether the ecologists can help the environmentalists to drive the point better that we are in real trouble on this planet. And I know it's with your formulas, it's probably extremely difficult, like the weather forecast, to come to a formula to explain that to the population where we are and where we are going, and maybe illustrating more the point how much in danger we are. Because we are all interconnected with living species and also with plants. I mean, Alexander von Humboldt mentioned that already 200 years ago.
Yes, which, by the way, is a fabulous book for any of you that haven't read that recent account of his life. You know, this is a very hard question because I don't know the answer, because you know, people have been talking about this for a long time. And it's not something that we have just come to realize, that there is concern over the human population and the sustainability of the planet. You know, a lot of very smart people, fairly influential people, have recognized that. It is not so much, I think, that people don't believe the concern, as it is more that we simply don't have the economic or political will to intercede. That seems to me, from my corner, that seems to be the bigger problem. It's not the failure to understand, and it's a complicated dynamic of behavior, what makes people do what they're going to do. And so I have opinions on that, but they aren't necessarily opinions that are worth much more than anyone else's opinion. You know, I mean, I got into this business as a graduate student because I not only was interested in nature, but because I was really concerned about the welfare of the globe going forward, and the earth and the animals and everything, including humans that live here, and was, you know, felt that that's what I wanted to spend my life doing, was trying to learn about things and help us develop a knowledge body for making good decisions about how we go forward. And so I have to say that the last decade, last few years in particular, have not been very encouraging. When you look at kind of the things that are happening, and kind of the particular, it seems, the mindsets of people in the major developed countries, and I would say, you know, really probably the three big drivers in that arena are North America, the United States, China, and Europe. Europe strikes me as being the most responsible of the three and the most willing to try to institute something that's a little more factually based. But it's just such a hard question. I mean, people have been asking this question for a long time. Most of you, or many of you, will remember, be aware of a very influential book that was published back in the 60s by Paul Ehrlich called The Population Bomb. And, Ehrlich was not shy about his projections of where we were headed. And he issued these really dire warnings about things that we needed to do and why they were important to achieve a sustainable world. And Ehrlich was, he advanced, I think, a very cogent argument, but he was challenged, and he was particularly challenged by economists. And so the real question was, to what degree do the details of what you're predicting, this is the question they put to him, how much do they really come true? And so not only did he predict particular things that would happen, but he predicted times at which those things would happen. And I think that was his big mistake, because a lot of the things didn't happen exactly at the times or near the times that he predicted they would happen. And therefore, people began to discount this general message. And it really was, I think, unfortunate that that happened, because there are an awful lot of us around that feel that there was a huge amount of truth in Ehrlich's vision.
Okay, maybe we'll take one last one. I don't know your name, but it says iPad. Did you have your hand up? Did you want to ask a question?
Mute.
It looks like your microphone is on. Well, I guess not. Well, I think maybe we'll wrap it up then, Jim. Yeah.
Okay. Well, again, like I said, I was sort of quaking in my boots before this one, because I thought, my God, what am I doing here? Coming into this group with some equations. I hope that they were at least somewhat digestible and that you kind of got something about population biology. I will say this, that going forward, next week is the stuff that I love the most, which is community and ecosystem ecology. And I think it's not as sort of conceptually complex. Empirically difficult, but not as conceptually complex as the stuff that we talked about today. So I hope that you will bear with me, and that you'll show up, and we'll get through that too. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm gonna go ahead and log off, unless Barry, you have anything that we needed to chat about, or
We're all set.
okay? Okay. Thanks.
Thanks.
Everyone.
Everybody.
Yeah.
So long.
Thanks,
Bye.
Jim.